Throughout the history of the Western world, it was commonly believed that human beings possess a metaphysical or immaterial soul. We find this belief in the ancient Greeks, Romans, and in medieval times. And it was only in the past 400 years that this belief has begun to waver in favor of the doctrine of materialism, which held that all phenomena arise from matter. Under the influence of scientific materialism, everything that could not be seen with the eyes or touched with the hands was held in doubt. Such things were even laughed at for their supposed affinity with metaphysics. Nothing was considered to be scientific or admitted to be true unless it could be perceived by the senses or traced back to physical causes. Materialism is the belief that everything fundamentally derives from material causes, and this belief became prominent among European thinkers as one of the great intellectual revolutions which science has brought about. This was a radical change in intellectual thinking, which has had many profound consequences. The doctrine of materialism has yielded some of the most important findings in the field of science, and has allowed humanity to progress to levels which our ancestors would likely find difficult to believe, and belief in the soul was regarded as silly, childish, and unintellectual. However, the psychologist Carl Jung wrote extensively on why this standpoint should be treated with more caution, and why belief in the soul, especially from the standpoint of psychology, is not as childish as it seems. By soul, Carl Jung is not referring to anything mystical or magical, but rather to the psyche. To understand Jung's position, we need to make a distinction between the brain and the psyche, or mind. The brain refers to the physical structure, which is responsible for generating the mind. When we speak of the brain, we are speaking of material things such as brain regions, nervous tissue, and chemical hormones. These are all physical, tangible things which can be directly observed and measured. The psyche, on the other hand, is immensely difficult to study and observe. The psyche or mind refers to the subjective experience which each person has. We can make observations of a person's brain, but this does not tell us what the person is feeling. Elements of the psyche include subjective emotions, perceptions, consciousness, and archetypes. To understand this distinction, consider the hormone serotonin, which is strongly associated with the emotion of happiness, although this is not the only role of serotonin in the body. Serotonin is a physical chemical, which can be measured in the blood, and if a person has the right levels of serotonin in their body, we might be able to speculate about their emotional state. However, we can't actually ever know their emotional state from this information, because emotions are a feature of the psyche and hence subjective. There is no quantitative method that will reveal beyond a shadow of a doubt what the person feels, and a person can only ever directly experience their own psyche. It would be wrong to conclude that the psyche and the brain are independent of each other, as we know this isn't the case. The psyche is dependent on physical matter, particularly the excitation of nerves in the brain and the release of chemical messengers from physiological glands. But what is the psyche itself? Is our subjective experience real or is it illusory? Modern materialism has a tendency to disregard the psyche by insisting that the psyche arises from chemical interactions in the brain, and in this sense, the psyche is nothing real, but merely a byproduct of physical processes. Belief in the substantiality of the spirit yielded more and more to the obtrusive conviction that material things alone have substance, till at last, after nearly 400 years, the leading European thinkers and investigators came to regard the mind as wholly dependent on matter and material causation. However, according to Jung, this way of looking at things is premature and short-sighted, and he regards it as a symptom of the modern spirit of the age. The spirit of the age, as Jung describes it, is how a society tends to think and believe in a given period. Before materialism, Europe's spirit of the age was wholly beset on a Christian worldview, and persecuted people who held different beliefs. The modern spirit of the age, especially in intellectual circles, tends to regard materialism as the basis for all intellectual inquiry. But the spirit of the age, according to Jung, is a psychological phenomenon which arises in every period and prevents discussion of unpopular ideas, fixes the canon of knowledge, and often makes serious intellectual errors. The spirit of the age cannot be compassed by the processes of human reason. It is an inclination, an emotional tendency that works upon weaker minds, through the unconscious with an overwhelming force of suggestion that carries them along with it. To think other than our contemporaries think is somehow illegitimate and disturbing. It is even indecent, morbid, or blasphemous, and therefore socially dangerous for the individual. Just as formerly, the assumption was unquestionable that everything that exists takes its rise from the creative will of a God who is spirit, so the 19th century discovered the equally unquestionable truth that everything rises from material causes. The modern world has experienced a radical change in perspective regarding the existence of a metaphysical psyche. Where once things were fundamentally spiritual in nature, the world is being seen as material at its most fundamental level, and all things are essentially physical in nature. This is even true of the mind, which is commonly regarded as nothing but the expression of certain physical processes taking place within the body. According to Jung, this reversal of outlook would be ludicrous if it were not one of the outstanding features of the spirit of the age. It is the popular way of thinking, and therefore it is decent, reasonable, scientific, and normal. Mind must be thought to be an epiphenomenon of matter. The same conclusion is reached if we say not mind but psyche, and in place of matter speak of brain, hormones, instincts, or drive. To grant the substantiality of the soul or psyche is repugnant to the spirit of the age, for to do so would be heresy. According to Carl Jung, it is important to accept the psyche as a real phenomenon, especially from the perspective of the individual. But how did this bias come about? It was a natural response to the fact that religious and spiritual dogma dominated metaphysics for the millennia preceding the scientific revolution. If we were conscious of the spirit of the age, we would know why we are so inclined to account for everything on physical grounds. We should know that it is because, up till now, too much was accounted for in terms of the spirit. This realization would at once make us critical of our bias. We should say, most likely, we are making as serious an error on the other side. Just as before, we believed that the nature of the world was spirit, and that this was a mistake, today we believe that everything is physical, and this leads to the possibility that we are making the same mistake, but this time on behalf of the reverse argument. The truth is, we don't fully understand either the psyche or matter, but we can say for certain that both of these concepts correspond to definitely observable facts. It is a fact, for instance, that when you touch an object, electrical impulses in touch receptors carry this information towards the brain. It is also a fact that this information can be felt by a person as a subjective sensation. If we say that all things are material, what can we say of the subjective sensation of touch? To a materialist, the answer is obvious, that is, that the sensation is caused by physical processes in the body. But a more philosophical inquiry may yield the question, but what about the sensation itself? Is the sensation also physical? A sensation may be predicated on physical interactions, but the subjective sensation itself is psychic, and in some sense, immaterial. One problem with materialism is that it uses matter as the explanatory principle behind all observable phenomena, including the psyche. However, the nature of matter isn't fully understood by science, and so saying that everything arises from matter is an incomplete explanation. By saying that consciousness arises from neurons in the brain isn't necessarily wrong, but it is incomplete, both from the standpoint of matter and the psyche, as it is still unclear how matter is capable of producing consciousness and other mental phenomena. What or who indeed is this all-powerful matter? It is once more man's picture of a creative God, stripped this time of his anthropomorphic traits and taking the form of a universal concept whose meaning everyone presumes to understand. Materialism in this sense isn't an explanation of consciousness, it is rather an attempt to explain consciousness away. This way of looking at things also hinders intellectual attempts to understand the psyche. As Jung writes, we delude ourselves with the thought that we know much more about matter than about a metaphysical mind, and so we overestimate physical causation and believe that it alone affords us a true explanation of life. To anybody who regards themselves as a rational thinker, it may seem like Carl Jung is trying to say that matter isn't responsible for consciousness and the psyche, but his position is actually more nuanced and deeper than this. This is in no way to deny the close connection of psychic happenings with the physiological structure of the brain, with the glands, and the body in general. Instead, the idea that all things are material causes us to fail in giving the psyche the weight and emphasis it deserves. Since the psyche is the subject of psychology, it is important to treat the psyche as something which is definitively real in its own right. According to Jung, this approach reduces psychic happenings to a kind of activity of the glands. Thoughts are regarded as secretions of the brain, and so we achieve a psychology without the psyche. From this standpoint, it must be confessed, the psyche does not exist in its own right. It is nothing in itself, but is the mere expression of physical processes. This point of view isn't inherently wrong, but we know for certain that the psyche exists in its own right, and whether it is dependent on matter or not is irrelevant. Consider this thought experiment. What is thinking? When we think, an inner monologue of words or images appears in our psyche. From the perspective of materialism, this involves the excitation of nervous tissue and the use of energy in the form of ATP molecules. But what are the thoughts themselves? Physical processes occur, but are the thoughts physical? If we hear an inner voice speaking and thinking, is this voice physical? Does it involve sound waves inside the brain? And if not, does this mean that thoughts aren't real? Clearly, thoughts are real, but it seems that thoughts are purely abstract and purely psychic and immaterial. Chemical processes within the brain definitely do mediate the process of thinking. The thoughts themselves are a product of the psyche, which does not seem to have a physical nature. If you studied someone's brain closely and made note of everything and how it all interacted, would you be able to know what a person is thinking? It seems, at least in the present, that we are effectively closed off from the psyche of another person. What bulk can we ascribe to thoughts, asks Jung. Are they small, large, long, thin, heavy, fluid, straight, circular, or what? What they are, and in fact what consciousness is not clear, but it is clear that to reduce everything to physical processes does not explain why it is that thoughts seem to be real, and why, despite their apparent immateriality, they can influence our behavior. The same can be said about the images produced in our dreams. These dream images are generated in the same manner as thoughts, involving chemical reactions and electrical impulses, but are these images real? If you close your eyes and imagine, for instance, an elephant, is the image you see in your mind real? Is it made of matter? We can't say for sure, but we can say that the psyche which holds these images has its own intangible and even possibly non-physical reality. What we experience as the psyche does have a reality in its own right, and so while it may depend on material causation, it is important not to merely regard the psyche as an illusion or as nothing real in itself. The psyche is real without a doubt, although it is immensely difficult to study. But why should we give so much emphasis to our psyche? After all, if the psyche is simply our subjective point of view, it wouldn't seem as important as the empirical world from an objective point of view. Actually, however, the psyche is usually more important to the individual, since we can only experience the world through our own subjective experience. All things we experience occur through the filter of our sense perceptions, and how we think about the world is also subject to our psychic condition. How we interpret a given event depends upon our mood and psychic state. For example, our psyches influence how we feel about a given movie, whether we like it or not. If we are in a bad mood, we may be more inclined to think poorly of the movie. But if we are in a good mood, we may view the movie in a more positive light. Without a doubt, psychic happenings constitute our only immediate experience. All that I experience is psychic. Even physical pain is a psychic event which belongs to my experience. We are in all truth so enclosed by psychic images that we cannot penetrate to the essence of things external to ourselves. All our knowledge is conditioned by the psyche, which, because it alone is immediate, is superlatively real. Here, there is a reality to which the psychologist can appeal, namely, psychic reality. In this sense, our psyche may be responsible for causing us to be biased, and to paint a picture of the world which isn't necessarily correct. Jung was heavily influenced by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose idea of transcendental idealism highlights why it is that we need to become aware of the reality of our psyche. Kant distinguishes between phenomena and noumena. The noumenal world can be thought of as the objective physical world, and the phenomenal world is how this world appears to us. Since we must always observe the world through our sense perceptions, we can only ever perceive the phenomenal world. When you perceive an object, your brain generates an image, i.e., the image appears to you as a phenomenon. You can never perceive things as they actually are, because you must always perceive the world through your sense perceptions, which are imperfect. A concrete example comes from the sensation of touch. You can't ever actually touch an object, because the electrons in your skin repel the electrons of the object, and this creates a gap between your skin and the object. What you feel is the force created by the repelling electrons. The sensation of touch is thus a phenomenon generated by your brain. The phenomenal world that appears to our subjective senses can be thought of as a mental map of the world, but it is not the world itself. The noumenal world, or the world of things in themselves, will always be out of the reach of human perception. Another important reason why the psyche deserves a higher level of recognition pertains to the spiritual life of the individual. The psyche of an individual person is of the utmost importance to that individual. Materialism, and the scientific advances it has brought about, has important ramifications for the progress of a collective society, but at the individual level, it can be argued that the psyche is far more important. A person must go through their lives making various decisions. What career will I choose? Who do I want to spend the rest of my life with? What values and beliefs will I hold? These decisions must be made with respect to a person's personality, and personality is something psychic and immaterial. Without an understanding of your own personality, it may be difficult to live according to your inborn nature, but personality is a unique phenomenon that cannot be simply reduced to physical facts. There is and can be no self-knowledge based on theoretical assumptions, for the object of this knowledge is an individual, a relative exception and an irregular phenomenon. Hence, it is not the universal and regular that characterize the individual, but rather the unique. He is not to be understood as a recurrent unit, but as something unique and singular, which in the last analysis can be neither known nor compared with anything else. The reality of psychic events is further exemplified by the difference between two different forms of psychological treatment, psychotherapy and drugs. Drugs, by chemical influence, by and far have the most easily measurable impact when dealing with psychological issues such as depression and anxiety, and in this sense, they can be utilized as effective treatments. However, there may be consequences to becoming overly dependent on psychological medication, such as developing dependencies or addiction. In contrast, psychotherapy is a much slower and generally less effective method of treatment, but it can be viewed as an attempt to cure the illness by directly influencing the person's psyche. Carl Jung was first and foremost a doctor, and he was able to successfully treat many of his patients by helping them to understand their unconscious personalities, so that they could develop life strategies which could help make their lives feel more meaningful. The modern world prefers to use physical rather than psychic strategies for dealing with illness, but we shouldn't undermine the psychic factor as well. For example, a suitable explanation or comforting word to the patient may have something like a healing effect, which may even influence the glandular secretions. The doctor's words, to be sure, are only vibrations in the air, yet they constitute a particular set of vibrations corresponding to a particular psychic state in the doctor. The words are effective only insofar as they convey a meaning or have significance. It is their meaning which is effective, but meaning is something mental or spiritual. Call it a fiction if you like. Nonetheless, it enables us to influence the course of the disease in a far more effective way than with chemical preparations. We should note that Jung made this statement back when chemical treatments were still in their infancy, and back then, psychotherapy was still the preferred method of treatment. But nevertheless, Jung's words help us to understand why the psychic factor is so important. If a person you know is going through a hard time, for example, if they have recently lost their job, speaking with them and offering comfort may make them feel better. In a physical sense, all that has happened are mechanical sound waves have struck their eardrums. But because these sound waves contain a meaning, they have an impact upon the person. The same can be said when one looks at a work of art they may find beautiful. All that happens in a physical sense are light waves bouncing off of the art and entering the person's eyes. But the emotions we feel constitute the way the art impacts us from the standpoint of the psyche. Thus, psychic reality is something we can scarcely deny. Psychic reality exists in its original oneness, and awaits man's level of consciousness, where he no longer believes in one part and denies the other, but recognizes both as constituent elements of one psyche. We may well point to the idea of psychic reality as the most important achievement of modern psychology. though it is scarcely recognized as such. It seems to me only a question of time for this idea to be generally accepted. In the end, Jung admits that it is certainly possible that what we experience as the psyche may ultimately be just a byproduct of our physiological condition, and therefore nothing real in itself. Ultimately, he warns against being too one-sided about either point of view. And finally, in the face of all of these admissions, we must ask ourselves if the psyche is not after all a secondary manifestation, an epiphenomenon, and completely dependent upon the body. In the light of reason, and of our commitments as practical men to an actual world, we say yes. Materialism in the end may be reflective of the true nature of the psyche and of the universe itself, but we should still regard the psyche as something real in itself. Both perspectives of spirit and matter deserve sufficient weight, since both concepts are fundamentally inscrutable, and until we understand the true nature of matter and the psyche, it would be wrong to be too rigid or dogmatic about the nature of either. In treating his patients, Jung attempted to take a balanced approach. Here we come to a question which is often attended by mortal danger, the question whether we base our explanations upon matter or upon spirit. We must never forget that everything spiritual is illusion from the naturalistic standpoint, and that the spirit, to ensure its own existence, must often deny and overcome an obtrusive physical fact. If I recognize only naturalistic values, and explain everything in physical terms, I shall depreciate, hinder, or even destroy the spiritual development of my patients, and if I hold exclusively to a spiritual interpretation, then I will misunderstand and do violence to the natural man in his right to existence as a physical being.